The Arkansas frontier in the winter of 1846 stretched raw and unforgiving, a land where pine forests bled into rocky hillsides and the wind carried both promise and warning. The town of Belmont had sprouted along the western edge of the territory like a weed determined to strangle whatever grew before it. Wooden storefronts lined a muddy main street, their fresh-cut lumber still weeping sap. Behind them, newer structures pushed outward. A trading post, a church with an unfinished steeple, homes with stone foundations sunk deep into earth that had never asked to bear them. The settlement had appeared almost overnight, built by families who'd traveled from Tennessee, Missouri, and the Carolinas with dreams of land ownership and prosperity. They came with wagons loaded with tools, livestock, and an unshakable conviction that this territory belonged to them simply because they'd claimed it. The federal government had opened these lands for settlement 3 years prior, drawing lines on maps and declaring regions available without consulting those who'd lived here for generations. Beneath it all lay something the settlers refused to acknowledge: graves, not marked with crosses or carved stones, but graves nonetheless. The Apache who had lived here, who had hunted these woods, sung to these streams, buried their dead in careful circles aligned with the stars, had been driven west years before. The removal had been systematic and brutal. Treaties signed under duress, food supplies cut off during winter months, militia raids on villages that left women and children fleeing into forests with nothing but the clothes on their backs. What remained were only traces: arrowheads turned up by plows, fire-darkened stones in places where no white man had ever built a hearth, pictographs on cliff faces that the settlers either couldn't read or chose to ignore, and the silence of a people erased from maps but not from memory. Taza knew every one of those graves. He was 28 years old, lean and dark-eyed, with hair that hung past his shoulders in the traditional way despite the stares it earned him. His face carried the sharp angles of his mother's people: high cheekbones, a strong jaw, eyes that seemed to look through things rather than at them. His mother had been Apache, one of the last to leave this land. His father had been a trapper, a French-Canadian named Jean-Baptiste, who'd loved her fiercely and died of fever before Taza turned 10. She'd raised him alone, teaching him 2 languages, 2 ways of seeing, 2 codes of survival. She taught him English so he could walk among settlers without fear. She taught him Apache so he would never forget who his people were. Most importantly, she taught him the names. Every winter evening of his childhood, she would sit by the fire and recite them: names of warriors, mothers, children, elders who had lived and died on this land. She made him repeat each one until his tongue could shape the sounds perfectly. She told him their stories: how Red Knife had defended a hunting party from a grizzly bear, fighting the beast with only a knife, and his courage until others could drive it away. How Pale Moon had delivered twins during a thunderstorm so violent that trees were splitting around the birthing lodge, her hands steady and her voice calm as she guided the babies into a world that roared with lightning. How Silent Crow had been the fastest runner in 3 generations, able to cover 50 miles in a day, carrying messages between villages. She told him about the medicine women who could identify 300 different plants and knew which would heal wounds, which would ease childbirth pain, which would calm a mind tormented by visions. She spoke of the hunters who could track a deer for days through changing weather, reading stories in broken twigs and disturbed leaves. She described the basket weavers, whose patterns contained mathematical precision passed down through dozens of generations. When she died 5 years ago, wasting away from a sickness that turned her skin yellow and her eyes hollow, her final words were a whisper: "Remember them. You are the last who will." So he remembered. Belmont's citizens knew him as Tom Walker, a name he'd adopted to move among them with less friction. It was common enough, forgettable, the kind that didn't draw attention or invite questions. He worked odd jobs, mending fences for farmers who paid poorly but regularly, hauling lumber for construction crews, breaking horses for men who paid in coin and suspicion. He was good with animals, possessing a patience that seemed unnatural to men who believed dominance was the only way to train a creature. He kept his head down, his words few, his past vague. When men asked where he'd come from, he said simply, "Around here," and offered nothing more. Some suspected anyway. His features were too distinct, his manner too different, but as long as he worked hard and caused no trouble, they were willing to overlook what they couldn't quite categorize. But once each month, when the moon thinned to a silver thread, he walked to the old burial grounds north of town. The sight was unremarkable to anyone who didn't know what to look for. A clearing where the pines formed a near-perfect circle, where the earth rose in subtle mounds no plough had yet disturbed. To a casual observer, it might seem like natural terrain variation. But Taza knew better. His mother had brought him here as a child, teaching him to recognize the signs, the way the mounds were spaced at exact intervals, the positioning aligned with cardinal directions, the stones that had been placed deliberately. Taza would kneel at the edge of the circle and speak to the dead in his mother's language. The words came easily to his tongue, despite years of speaking primarily English. He told them what had become of their land, how trees they'd known as saplings had been cut down to build houses, how streams they'd fished had been dammed to power mills, how trails they'd walked for generations had been widened into roads. He told them about the town that sprawled across their hunting paths. He told them he had not forgotten. The settlers called it witchcraft. They'd seen him there on moonless nights, lips moving in a language that sounded like wind through dry grass. They'd seen him place sage and tobacco on the ground, offerings that smoldered and vanished by morning. To people raised to fear anything that didn't fit within Christian orthodoxy, his rituals seemed dark and dangerous. Women made signs against evil when his name was mentioned. Men muttered about savage practices. Rumors spread like fever. He's calling spirits. He's cursing the town. He's planning something. He's placing hexes that will make crops fail and children sicken. Sheriff Harlan Gaines, a thick-necked man with a cavalry saber he'd never earned the right to carry, confronted Taza one cold February morning outside the livery. Gaines had come to Arkansas from Georgia 5 years prior, bringing with him the attitudes of the Deep South and a firm belief in white superiority. He wore the saber conspicuously on his hip, claiming he'd taken it from a Mexican officer, though anyone who pressed him for details received only vague stories. "You got business in those woods, Walker?" Gaines stood too close, his breath fogging the air between them, smelling of coffee and tobacco. Taza met his eyes without flinching. He'd learned early that showing fear to men like Gaines only invited more aggression. Paying respects. To who? Ain't no Christian graves out there. Not everything sacred needs a cross, Sheriff. Gaines's jaw worked like he was chewing something bitter. His face reddened slightly. Folks are nervous. They see you skulking around at night, muttering in that heathen tongue. Makes them wonder what you're up to. I'm up to remembering, Taza said quietly. That's all. Well, maybe you ought to remember somewhere else. This is white man's country now. Has been for years. Whatever was here before, it's gone, dead and buried. Time you accepted that and moved on. Taza's silence was answer enough. Gaines leaned closer, his voice dropping to a threat. You keep stirring up trouble, and I'll see to it you find yourself at the end of a rope. Understood? We got laws here, and one of them is keeping the peace. You make folks nervous. You're disturbing that peace. Taza turned and walked away without another word. Behind him, Gaines spat into the mud and muttered something about savages who didn't know their place. That night, Taza returned to the burial grounds. The February cold bit through his coat, turning his breath to white clouds. Ice crystals had formed on the pine needles, making the forest glitter in the starlight. He knelt in the frozen grass and whispered the names one by one, as his mother had taught him. Red Knife, Pale Moon, Silent Crow, Grey Sky, Two Rivers, Little Sparrow, Stands Alone, Walks Far, Morning Star, Dancing Water. The list went on. 47 names in total, 47 individuals whose lives had mattered, whose deaths deserved acknowledgement. The wind carried the names into the darkness, and for a moment, just a moment, he thought he heard something answer. His mother had told him that the dead didn't truly leave, that they remained in the land they'd loved, watching over it, waiting for someone to remember them properly. By spring, the town had doubled in size. New families arrived weekly, drawn by rumors of fertile land and opportunity. Wagons rolled in laden with furniture, farming equipment, livestock, and hopes for a fresh start. The main street expanded, new businesses opening. A second general store, a blacksmith shop, a seamstress, a lawyer's office. The population had swelled to nearly 300 souls. Among the newcomers was Daniel Croft, a broad-shouldered entrepreneur from Tennessee who'd made his fortune in cotton and now sought to expand into trade. He was 42 years old, with graying temples and the kind of confidence that came from decades of getting what he wanted. He dressed better than anyone else in town, wearing tailored suits even in the muddy frontier settlement. He had plans for Belmont, a proper trading post that would serve travelers passing through the territory, roads connecting to Little Rock and eventually to Memphis, contracts with merchants as far east as New Orleans. He saw opportunity where others saw wilderness, profit where others saw only raw land. He also had his eye on the clearing north of town. "Perfect location," Croft announced at a town meeting in late March, unrolling a surveyor's map across a table in the church. The building was packed with citizens eager to hear about developments that might increase their property values. Central, flat, plenty of space. We build there. We control commerce for 50 miles in every direction. Taza stood at the back of the room, unnoticed among the crowd. His hands were clenched so tight his knuckles had gone white. "What about the cemetery?" someone asked. It was old Samuel Hutchins, a farmer who'd been among the first settlers and had occasionally shown Taza small kindnesses. Croft frowned, genuine confusion crossing his face. "What cemetery?" "Indian graves, old ones. Tom Walker says there's sacred burial grounds there." "Tom Walker," Croft interrupted with a dismissive wave, "is a half-breed with a head full of superstition. There's no legal cemetery there, no markers, no records, no documentation. Just empty land that's sitting unused while this town needs to grow." "But if there are graves," Hutchins persisted, "then they're the graves of people who lost," Croft said flatly. "This is 1846, gentlemen. We're building a future, not preserving a past that doesn't belong here anymore. The Indians were relocated, legally, properly, by federal authority. Whatever they left behind is abandoned property. This land was purchased fair and square from the federal government," added Mayor Garrett. "We have legal title. Whatever was here before is irrelevant to our rights as property owners." The vote was unanimous, with only Samuel Hutchins abstaining, a small gesture that changed nothing. Taza walked out before it was called, unable to stomach watching hands raised to approve the desecration. The first shovels bit into the earth on a morning when the sky hung low and grey, pregnant with rain that wouldn't fall. Taza watched from the tree line as a crew of 8 men began clearing the burial grounds. They worked with the efficient brutality of men who believed the land owed them nothing. Axes rang against trees that had stood for a century. Brush was torn up by the roots and thrown into piles. The careful circle of pines was broken. Daniel Croft stood nearby, hands clasped behind his back, surveying the work like a general watching troops advance. He wore a fine grey suit, despite the muddy conditions. Occasionally, he consulted his surveyor's map, pointing to adjust the work crew's efforts. Sheriff Gaines leaned against a wagon, rifle across his lap, eyes scanning the woods. They were expecting trouble. They were hoping for an excuse. Gaines had made it clear to his deputies that if that half-breed showed up causing problems, they had authority to handle it however necessary. Taza didn't give them one. He watched as the shovels struck something solid, stone markers buried beneath decades of leaf rot and soil. The Apache had placed them carefully, stones selected for their shape and durability. The men pulled them free and tossed them aside like debris. He watched as they uncovered fragments of pottery, beautiful pieces decorated with geometric patterns that held meaning, that told stories. To the workers, they were just broken clay. They swept the fragments aside with boots, crushing some underfoot without noticing. He watched as they found beaded jewelry, necklaces of shell and bone and stone, painstakingly crafted. These had been buried with the dead as offerings, as comfort for the journey to the spirit world. The men held them up briefly, examining them with detached curiosity, then threw them onto a growing pile. He watched as they discovered a child's doll carved from cottonwood, its features worn smooth by small hands that had loved it. One of the workers laughed at its crude appearance. He tossed it aside without a second thought. None of it mattered to them. None of it was real. One of the workers paused, holding up a human femur, the bone yellowed with age. Jesus Christ, there really are bodies here. His voice carried a note of unease. So bury it somewhere else, Croft said without looking up from his plans. We've got a schedule to keep. The foundation needs to be poured by week's end. The bone was thrown into a pile with the stones and pottery, landing with a hollow clatter. Tarza's vision blurred red at the edges. His hands shook with the effort of remaining still, of not charging into the clearing to tear those shovels from their hands. His mother's voice echoed in his memory. Remember them. You are the last who will. But what did remembering mean if he stood by and watched them be destroyed? What good were names if the bodies they belonged to were treated like refuse? He turned and walked deeper into the forest before he did something he couldn't take back. His feet carried him along paths he'd known since childhood, trails that wound through pine groves and across streams. He walked for hours, barely seeing where he was going. For 3 days, he stayed away. He worked at the livery, breaking a sorrel mare that tried to kill him twice and respected him for surviving it. The mare was young and wild, recently captured from a herd that roamed the hills. She threw him repeatedly, once slamming him against the corral fence hard enough that he tasted blood. But he got back on, again and again, until finally she stopped fighting. He ate alone in his small room above the livery, meals of salt pork and cornmeal that tasted like ash. He slept fitfully, plagued by dreams where he heard voices calling his name in Apache, accusing him of cowardice, demanding to know why he let this happen. On the 4th day, he returned to the clearing. The trading post's frame had already been raised, skeletal wooden ribs reaching toward the sky like a corpse trying to resurrect itself. The grave circle was obliterated, replaced by foundation stones and trampled earth. All trace of the careful arrangement, the sacred geometry, had been erased. A pile of bones and artifacts sat discarded at the clearing's edge, waiting to be burned or buried or simply forgotten. The workers had apparently decided it was easier to pile everything together and deal with it later. Tarza knelt beside the pile. His hands moved through the fragments carefully, reverently, as if by handling them properly, now he could somehow atone for the violence they'd suffered. He found a necklace of bear claws that had belonged to a warrior named Two Rivers. His mother had described it to him, told him how Two Rivers had earned each claw by hunting bears that threatened the village. He found a stone pipe carved with a thunderbird, the mark of a medicine woman named Grey Sky, who had been renowned for her wisdom. The pipe's bowl was cracked, but the carving was still visible. He found the cottonwood doll, its face worn smooth by a child's hands, and remembered his mother telling him about a girl named Little Sparrow, who had died of winter fever at age 6, how her parents had carved this doll for her just days before she sickened. He found bone fragments, pottery shards, a stone tool polished smooth by countless hands, a small basket woven so finely it could have held water, beads scattered like tears. Each piece represented a person, a life, a story that deserved better than this anonymous heap. You don't belong here. Tarza looked up to find Sheriff Gaines standing 10 feet away, hand resting on his pistol. The sheriff's face was set in lines of grim satisfaction. Neither do you. Taza said quietly, rising slowly to his feet. The cottonwood doll remained clutched in his hand. This land was bought and paid for, legal and proper. I got the deed documents myself at the land office in Little Rock. You can't buy what was stolen. Gaines's face darkened, his neck reddening above his collar. Nothing was stolen. The government made treaties with the Indians, gave them land out west, and opened this territory for settlement. That's not theft, that's law. Progress, Taza repeated, his voice flat. Is that what you call throwing a child's doll on a garbage pile? Is that what you call using human bones as inconveniences to be shoveled aside? I call it making use of land that was sitting empty. Indians were relocated years ago. If they left stuff behind, that's their problem, not ours. They didn't leave it behind. They're buried here. This is a cemetery. These are graves. Not legally. Show me the deed that says this is protected burial ground. Show me the documentation. Gaines stepped closer. You can't because there aren't any. Your people didn't keep records. So yeah, maybe there are some old bones here. But without paperwork, it's just empty land. Taza stared at him, realizing the absolute futility of this conversation. Gaines wasn't cruel exactly. He was worse. He was certain. He genuinely believed that documentation mattered more than human remains, that paperwork outweighed reverence. You got a problem with progress. That's your burden, Gaines continued. But you keep coming around here making trouble, and You'll what? Taza interrupted. Hang me for kneeling in the dirt? Shoot me for speaking my mother's language? I'll do what's necessary to keep the peace. There is no peace here, Sheriff. There's only silence, and silence isn't the same thing. For a long moment they stared at each other across the desecrated earth. Then Gaines spat and walked away, muttering something about savages and their goddamn pride. Taza stayed until sunset, gathering what he could carry. He wrapped the artifacts in his coat carefully, treating each piece with the reverence it deserved. The bear claw necklace, the stone pipe, the cottonwood doll, pottery fragments, beads, everything small enough to transport. He brought them to a cave he knew in the hills, a place the settlers hadn't found yet because it required knowing which seemingly solid rock face actually concealed an entrance. Inside, the cave opened into a chamber large enough to stand in, dry and protected. He arranged the artifacts carefully on a flat stone altar he constructed. He placed them according to tradition. Pipe to the east where the sun rose, necklace to the west where it set, doll to the south where warmth came from. He burned sage, letting the smoke purify the space. He spoke the names of those whose possessions these had been. Then he sat in the darkness and made his decision. He had tried to live between two worlds. He had tried to remember quietly, to honor the dead without disturbing the living. He had worked their jobs, learned their language, adopted a name they could pronounce, made himself as small and inoffensive as possible. But the living had made that impossible. They had dug up bones and called it progress. They had erased graves and called it legal. They had silenced his people twice, once by driving them away, and now by pretending they had never existed at all. His mother had taught him restraint. She had taught him to adapt, to endure, to survive, but she had also taught him the warrior code. When words fail, when law fails, when even memory fails, then action is the only language left. Not violence for its own sake, but action that restores balance, that answers injustice. Daniel Croft's trading post opened on a Saturday in late April. The entire town turned out for the celebration. Speeches about prosperity and civilization, whiskey flowing freely, a pig roasted over an open fire, children running wild while their parents toasted Belmont's bright future. The post itself was impressive, 2 stories tall, with glass windows transported from St. Louis, shelves already stocked with goods. Croft stood on the porch and delivered a speech that his audience received with enthusiastic applause. He spoke of prosperity, of how Belmont would become a hub of commerce, drawing traders from hundreds of miles. He spoke of civilization, of bringing order and opportunity to wild land. "We stand at the threshold of greatness," he proclaimed. What was once empty wilderness will become a center of trade and culture. This is the march of progress, and we are its vanguard. The crowd cheered. Men threw their hats in the air. Women dabbed at tears of pride. Children stuffed themselves with roasted pork. Taza stood at the edge of the crowd, unnoticed and silent. He watched Croft bask in adulation for building on bones. He watched families celebrate in a structure raised over desecrated graves. That night, when the celebrations ended and citizens stumbled home drunk on whiskey and optimism, Taza returned to the cave in the hills. He gathered the artifacts he'd saved and carried them down to what remained of the burial grounds. The clearing had been transformed. Where sacred ground had stood, there was now Croft's trading post, dominating the space like a monument to conquest. But around it, at the edges, traces of the old circle remained. Trees that hadn't been cut, earth that hadn't been churned, spaces where memory could still take root. The earth was scarred and broken, but it was still the earth. The trees still stood witness. The stars still wheeled overhead in patterns his ancestors had known by name. Taza knelt and began to dig with his bare hands. The soil was cold and damp from recent rain. His fingers scraped against stones and roots, nails tearing, knuckles bleeding as he worked. He dug until his hands were raw, until he'd carved out a shallow pit in the center of where the circle had been. This spot was sacred not just because his people had declared it so, but because love had made it sacred. The love of those who had carefully placed their dead here. He placed the artifacts inside carefully, arranging them the way his mother had described. Pipe to the east where dawn broke, necklace to the west where sunset faded, doll to the south where warmth originated, other items filling the spaces between. Stone tools that had shaped wood and hide, beads that had adorned bodies during ceremonies, pottery fragments that had held food and water. Then he covered them with soil and marked the spot with stones in the old way, a cairn that would mean nothing to settlers but everything to anyone who remembered. 7 stones, one for each direction, including sky, earth, and center. He sat beside the cairn and spoke the names. All of them, every warrior, mother, child, and elder his mother had taught him to remember. He spoke in Apache, his voice steady and clear. Red knife, pale moon, silent crow, grey sky, 2 rivers, little sparrow. Stands alone, walks far, morning star, dancing water. The names continued, 47 in total, each one a refutation of the claim that this land had been empty. When he finished, the sun was rising, painting the sky orange and gold. Taza walked into Belmont as the town was waking. Morning light slanted across the muddy streets. Smoke rose from chimneys. A rooster crowed. Life continued, ordinary and oblivious. He went directly to the trading post, where Daniel Croft was already at work behind the counter, tallying accounts in a leather-bound ledger. The store was empty except for the 2 of them. "We're not open yet," Croft said without looking up. "I didn't come to buy," Taza replied. Croft's eyes rose from his ledger, and for the first time he saw Taza clearly, not as Tom Walker, the half-breed handyman, but as something older and more dangerous. "What do you want? I want you to understand what you've done." Croft set down his pen, his expression hardening. "I've done nothing but provide opportunity for this town. If you've got a complaint, take it to the sheriff. The sheriff doesn't care. You don't care. None of you care." Taza's voice was quiet, but it filled the room like smoke. "You built this place on graves. You threw bones away like trash. You erased people who lived and loved and died here long before your grandfathers were born. That's progress," Croft said flatly. "The strong survive. The weak. My people weren't weak. They were outnumbered. There's a difference." Croft stood, his hand moving toward a pistol on the shelf behind him. "You threatening me, boy? I'm telling you the truth. There's a debt here. Blood and memory and broken promises. Someone has to answer for it. And that someone is you?" Croft's laugh was ugly. "You're one man, half savage, half nothing." Taza moved. He was across the counter before Croft could finish the sentence. his hand locking around the man's wrist before the pistol cleared the shelf. They struggled briefly. Croft was heavier, but Taza was faster, harder, shaped by years of surviving in a world that wanted him gone. The pistol clattered to the floor. Taza shoved Croft against the wall, his forearm pressed against the man's throat with just enough pressure to make breathing difficult. His eyes burned with something that made Croft's bravado crumble. "You will never understand," Taza said, barely above a whisper. "You will never care, so I will make you remember. Not because it will change you, but because someone has to." He released Croft and stepped back. The entrepreneur slumped against the wall, gasping, his face pale. "If you come near me again," Croft began. "I won't," Taza said. "I'm done talking." He walked out into the morning sunlight. By noon, Sheriff Gaines had assembled a posse. 8 men, armed with rifles and righteous anger, gathered outside the jail. He deputized them quickly, eager to demonstrate his authority. "Walker's made his intentions clear," Gaines announced. "He assaulted one of our most prominent citizens. He's made threats. He's a danger to everyone here, and it's our duty to bring him in, dead or alive." They found Taza at the livery, saddling a paint horse he'd gentled over the winter. The animal was beautiful, white with brown patches, intelligent eyes. He'd spent months earning her trust. He didn't run when the posse arrived. He simply turned and waited as they surrounded him, rifles raised. "Tom Walker," Gaines said, "you're under arrest for assault and making threats." "My name," Taza interrupted, "is Taza. Not Tom Walker, Taza. It was my grandfather's name. It means warrior, and I'm not going with you. You don't have a choice." "Everyone has a choice, Sheriff, even you. You could choose to acknowledge what was done to my people, but you won't." Taza looked at each man in turn, their faces set with certainty. "You think you've won. You think building on graves makes them disappear. But memory doesn't die just because you bury it. Someone always remembers. Someone always answers." "Enough talk," Gaines growled. "Take him." Taza's hand moved to his belt, where a knife hung in a beaded sheath, a gift from his mother. The posse tensed, but Taza didn't draw the knife. He simply smiled, a cold, terrible expression. "Not here," Taza said. "Not yet." Then he vaulted onto the paint horse and rode. The posse fired, but he was already gone, vanishing into the pine forest like smoke. Taza spent 3 days in the hills, moving between caves and clearings that existed on no settler's map. These were places his mother had shown him as a child, secret spots where Apache had hidden during conflicts, where water could be found even in summer drought. He hunted deer with a bow he'd carved himself, using techniques passed down through generations. The bow was made from Osage orange wood, its string twisted from sinew. His arrows were straight willow shafts, tipped with stone points he'd knapped himself. He ate sparingly, roasted meat cooked over fire so small they produced almost no smoke, water from streams that tasted of minerals, wild onions and roots. He slept in short cycles, always alert, and he prepared, not for war. He was one man, and war required numbers, but for justice, for balance, for the kind of answer that couldn't be ignored. The Apache code his mother had taught him was clear. When harm is done and no restitution is offered, restoration must come through action, not revenge. Revenge is about satisfying anger, but balance is about restoring what was broken. She'd explained it using the metaphor of scales. When someone takes from you unjustly, the world tips out of balance. If they won't correct it themselves, someone else must add weight to the other side. Not more weight than was taken, that would be revenge, but equal weight, the weight of consequence. On the night of the new moon, when darkness pressed thick and absolute against the earth, Taza returned to Belmont. He moved through shadows with practiced silence, his feet finding paths between buildings that kept him invisible. The town slept around him, its 300 souls dreaming of prosperity. He came first to the trading post. The building stood proud and new, its wooden walls smelling of sawdust and ambition. Taza circled it slowly, examining the structure with the careful eye of someone who understood how things were built, and therefore how they could be unmade. He found what he needed in the alley behind the store, barrels of lamp oil stacked carelessly near the back door. Croft had ordered them in bulk from St. Louis, planning to sell them at a profit. There were 6 barrels, each containing 5 gallons of refined petroleum that would burn hot and fast. Taza worked quickly and methodically. He used a crowbar to open the barrels. The oil flowed thick and golden brown in the starlight, carrying a sharp petroleum smell. He poured it along the building's base, soaking the wooden walls until they drank it like thirsty earth. The oil spread in dark stains, seeping into cracks between boards. Then he moved to the church, that symbol of spiritual conquest, its unfinished steeple pointing toward a heaven that had apparently sanctioned the erasure of his people. More oil, more careful application, then the general store, then the sheriff's office, that center of power that had used law as a weapon to justify injustice. He wasn't trying to destroy the town completely. He wasn't targeting homes where families slept. He was marking the symbols of power and commerce, the buildings that represented Belmont's ambition. When the oil was spread, Taza stood in the center of Main Street. The town slept around him, oblivious. Above, stars wheeled in patterns his ancestors had known, constellations that told stories, that marked seasons. He thought of his mother, her voice reciting names by firelight, her hands showing him how to prepare tobacco offerings. He thought of 2 rivers and grey sky and little sparrow, their bones treated as debris. He thought of every grave desecrated, every bone discarded, every memory deemed worthless by men who measured worth in dollars rather than in love and continuity. He struck flint against steel. Sparks cascaded in the darkness, bright points of light that fell like shooting stars. The 3rd strike caught, a tiny flame that seemed impossibly fragile. He touched it to a rag soaked in lamp oil. The fire came alive with a roar. It raced along the oil trail like a living creature, hungry, purifying, righteous. Flames climbed the trading post's walls with terrifying speed, reaching toward the roof in brilliant orange torrents. Wood crackled. Glass windows shattered from the heat. The roof caught, sending sparks spiraling into the sky. The fire woke the town. Men stumbled from their homes, half-dressed and shouting, minds fogged by sleep. Women screamed, grabbing children. People emerged in nightshirts, their faces painted with shock as they watched months of work burning. They grabbed buckets, organizing themselves into lines leading to the town well. But the water was useless against flames fed by oil. Each bucket seemed to make the fire larger, the water evaporating instantly or spreading the oil further. The church bell rang frantically, its bronze voice echoing across the frontier like a plea to an indifferent god. Taza stood in the shadows near the livery, watching. The paint horse stood beside him, calm despite the chaos. He felt no triumph, no satisfaction. Only the heavy certainty that this had been necessary. Someone had to answer. Someone had to remember. Someone had to become the voice of those who could no longer speak. Sheriff Gaines appeared, his face illuminated by firelight, his expression a mask of rage and helplessness. He wore only pants and boots, his suspenders hanging loose, his customary authority replaced by vulnerability. He scanned the crowd, searching desperately. When his eyes found Taza standing at the edge of the chaos, understanding dawned. "Walker!" Gaines roared, raising his pistol with a shaking hand. Taza didn't move, didn't hide. He simply waited as the sheriff approached, the gun steady in Gaines's hand, the flames painting them both in shades of orange and shadow. "You've killed us," Gaines said, his voice shaking. "You've destroyed everything we built, years of work, thousands of dollars, futures that families were counting on." "No," Taza replied quietly, his voice somehow carrying clearly. "I've reminded you. There's a difference. You can rebuild buildings. You can order new inventory. But the graves you built on, they'll still be there. The names you tried to erase, they'll still be spoken. "You'll hang for this," Gaines said, cocking the hammer. "I'll see you swing before sunrise. Maybe, but you can't kill what I remember. You can't unburn this fire. And somewhere, deep inside where you don't want to look, you know this wasn't random violence. You know this was answer to question you didn't want asked." Gaines's finger tightened on the trigger, and Then Daniel Croft's voice cut through the chaos. "The store. God help us, the whole store's gone. Everything's gone. $20,000 worth of inventory." Gaines hesitated, torn between vengeance and survival. The fire was spreading faster than anyone had anticipated, jumping from building to building. The church was fully involved, its unfinished steeple collapsing inward with a groan. The general store blazed like a funeral pyre. If they didn't act now, the entire town would burn. Homes would catch. People might die. "Go," Taza said quietly. "Save what you can. Protect your people. That's your job, isn't it?" Gaines lowered the gun, his face contorted with impotent fury. "This isn't over." "Yes," Taza said. "It is." He turned and mounted the paint horse in one fluid motion. The horse responded immediately, ears forward, muscles gathering. Taza rode slowly through the panicked crowd, moving at a walk rather than a gallop. He wanted them to see him, wanted them to remember his face. He met eyes with Samuel Hutchins, who stared back with a mixture of horror and something that might have been understanding. No one tried to stop him. They were too busy fighting the fire, too consumed by desperation. As he reached the edge of town, Taza turned the horse to look back. The fire had reached its peak. 4 buildings fully involved, flames reaching 50 feet into the air, smoke billowing in massive clouds. The heat was intense even at this distance. He watched people work desperately to save their homes. He watched the trading post collapse in on itself with a crash that sent sparks spiraling upward. He watched the church steeple crumble and fall, its cross tumbling through the air. By dawn, Belmont was a ruin. The trading post, the church, the general store, the sheriff's office, all reduced to blackened skeletons and ash. The homes survived and no lives were lost, but the town's ambition had been gutted. Taza rode west toward the territories where the Apache had been driven. The paint horse moved steadily beneath him. He carried nothing but his mother's knife, a small pouch of sacred tobacco, the clothes on his back, and the weight of every name he'd been taught to remember. He didn't know if he'd find his people. The Apache had been scattered across territories, struggling to survive on land that couldn't support their numbers. Many had died in the years since relocation. He didn't know if they'd accept him, half white as he was, raised between worlds. He might arrive to find he was as much an outsider among the Apache as he'd been among the settlers, but he knew he couldn't stay in Arkansas. Couldn't stay in a land where graves were treated as obstacles and memory was deemed worthless. As the sun rose behind him, painting the Arkansas hills in shades of gold and red that reminded him of fire, Taza spoke the names one final time. His voice carried across the empty land, a prayer, a promise, a defiant act of remembering. Red Knife, Pale Moon, Silent Crow, Grey Sky, 2 Rivers, Little Sparrow, Stands Alone, Walks Far, Morning Star, Dancing Water, 47 names, 47 lives, 47 souls who had loved this land, who deserved better than to be erased from history. He had been the last Apache who spoke to the dead, not because he communed with spirits, but because he carried their stories, their names, their unresolved injustices in his memory, and refused to let them be forgotten. He had carried their stories when no one else would. He had spoken their names when silence was easier. He had stood as witness when the world insisted there was nothing to see. And when words had failed, when law had failed, when even restraint had failed, he had answered in the only language the settlers understood. Not with chaos, not with mindless destruction, but with fire that purified, flame that marked, smoke that would carry the memory of desecrated graves into the lungs and minds of everyone who had dared to build on stolen ground. The fire had been precise, calculated, targeted at symbols of power rather than at innocent lives. It had been designed not to kill, but to make them see, to force them to confront what they'd done. Balance had been restored. Not perfect balance. Nothing could truly restore what had been lost. But the scales had been adjusted. The debt had been acknowledged. The cost of erasure had been made visible. And somewhere beneath the ashes of Belmont, in a cairn of stones arranged the old way, artifacts of the forgotten rested in earth that finally, reluctantly, remembered them. Taza rode on through the morning, the paint horse's hooves beating a steady rhythm. Behind him, Belmont would rebuild. They'd clear the ruins, salvage what they could, order new materials. Daniel Croft would curse his losses. Sheriff Gaines would organize posses to hunt for the arsonist, though they'd never find him, but they would remember. Even if they never admitted it aloud, even if they told themselves stories about savage violence, some part of them would remember that the fire hadn't been random, that it had been answer to question they didn't want asked. And in their remembering, however unwilling, the dead would live on. The names would persist, the graves would matter, even if only as the reason for ruins and smoke. Taza carried the names with him, a living monument to people who had loved this land long before it had been claimed and conquered. Someone had to remember. Someone had to answer. Someone had to become the voice of those who could no longer speak. He had done all three, and that would have to be enough. The sun climbed higher, warm on his back as he rode toward an uncertain future. Behind him, smoke still rose from Belmont's ruins, a dark column visible for miles, a marker, a memorial, a message written in ash and embers. The land would remember, even if the people didn't. And somewhere in the hills he'd left behind, in a cave known only to him, artifacts of the forgotten rested on stone, waiting for the day when someone else might find them and wonder whose hands had placed them there. Memory didn't die. It just waited for someone willing to carry it forward. Taza rode west, carrying the names into whatever came next.